there, welcome to part 6 in our series on the Lord's Prayer. Hey, it has been so much fun hearing from you throughout this series about how God is meeting you and how the Lord's Prayer is taking on a whole new sense of joy and excitement in your life and what you are learning. It's been so great to hear all of you posting on social media at walkingthetext.com, sending in emails. And I would just simply say this, if you know someone who just needs to hear one of these episodes or needs to be invited in the teaching series, would love to encourage you just to share this with friends and family and for those who you know need to hear this. Well, hey, we are now in the part on the Lord's Prayer where Jesus tells us to offer 3 petitions to God. Our daily bread, which we're going to tackle in this episode, talking about then forgiveness, which we're going to talk about in the next episode, and then the episode following that, deliverance from temptation and evil. So that's kind of where we're going over these next 3 episodes, and now we get to talk about our daily bread. So let's be reminded where we're at in the midst of the prayer. Our Father, who is in heaven, right, always near us, holy be your name. May God's name go out. May people kneel to God, because when people acknowledge who God is and experiences His forgiveness and grace and mercy, like the world changes. Your kingdom come, your will be done here on earth as it is in heaven. Right, and I hope last week's episode just really got you excited and challenged you. And, one of the things I always say is that when we study the text in context and we draw out some things that maybe we've never seen before, it should make more sense of the text. And so now you begin to understand 50 times in Matthew alone when Jesus is talking about the kingdom, what He is getting after. And so we talked about last week how the cross and the empty tomb has done something for us, it is doing something in us, but it also wants to do something through us. And so every day we wake up orienting our little kingdoms to God's kingdom so that His will, His way, His glory advances here in the world. And so now it's on the heels of this where Jesus goes, okay, in order to live that out, here are 3 requests, here are 3 petitions. And the first thing He says is, give us today our daily bread. Now, before we jump into what does this mean for us, we got to do what we always do, and that is to ask the question, what did this mean for them then? And in part to answering that question is Jesus' teaching is to ask the question, what passage or story is Jesus drawing upon from His Bible, the Older Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures that Jesus may be speaking into in the midst of this moment. And so when Jesus says our daily bread, do you know of any story in the Bible where people received daily bread? And you'd go, oh, this is the manna story in the desert. Yes. So this is another part of the Lord's Prayer that grounds us in the Exodus story. So as we talked in the episode on our Father, the first time God says Father or identifies Himself as a father, He does so in Exodus 4 when He's rescuing and redeeming the Israelites from their slavery in Egypt. And so they come out into the desert and they're hungry, and for the next 40 years, God provides for them daily bread, manna. Well, actually, technically on the Sabbath, there is no bread. We talked about that in the Sabbath series. But typically, the other 6 days of the week, God is providing daily bread. And so when we think about the Exodus story, we go, oh, this was a very vulnerable time for the Israelites who were in the desert. And God demonstrated Himself as trustworthy. And the people learned to depend upon God, that God desires to be our daily source of sustenance. And He demonstrated that to the Israelites. And so when Jesus says, give us this day our daily bread, this meant something to Jesus's first hearers. They would have recalled that story in the desert, but they would have also recalled another story which we talked about in the Bread of Life series when we talked about John chapter 6. And we showed you a reference that in the first century world, the people were talking about that when the Messiah comes, who is the second Moses leading a new Exodus, will actually bring manna again. The manna story will happen again. And so we explored that with the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000 and how Jesus interacted with the people on that notion of the manna coming from heaven again, and how Jesus is saying, that is who I am. Now, the people on the hillside this day, they don't know that yet. That doesn't seem to be part of the teaching that Jesus has offered yet. That comes later in the story. But when Jesus is saying, give us our daily bread, for them, they would have heard. Just like at the first Exodus, this is about revolution. This is about redemption. This is about restoration. And as we've talked in this series, Jesus is not only giving this prayer for people to pray to God, it's the prayer that he is living out in his life and in his ministry. Now, Jesus will go to the cross and die for the sins of the world, and he will rise from the grave in the empty tomb, conquering death. And so sin and death are conquered at the cross and in the empty tomb. So what does this mean for us when we come to the Lord's Prayer and say, give us this day our daily bread? Well, as we explored in last week's episode, right, when Jesus dies on the cross and rises from the empty tomb, sin and death, which were linked, were shattered, but it's not to the very end of the story of human history where God's fullness and shalom will take up full residence here on earth. And so our calling is to join God in orienting our kingdoms to his kingdom so that his kingdom advances on earth, his shalom comes, and it pushes out the darkness. And so even though Jesus has died and has risen again, the fullness of the effect of what happened 2,000 years ago isn't going to be seen in its entirety until the very end of the story, the picture that Revelation 21 and 22 gives us. So when we say, give us this day our daily bread, we are in essence backing up the your kingdom come, your will be done here on earth as is in heaven, because we're saying, God, you need to give me what I need to live out what you're calling me to do so that your kingdom would advance here on earth as it is in heaven. And so on the one hand, it's like revolution, redemption, restoration. It is on its way. On the other hand, the first time it was in the midst of vulnerable circumstances that God gave daily bread. And so it all joins together to go. There are things in our lives where we feel vulnerable, or we have these daily needs, or we're struggling in some way, or like we need something to happen in order to live out God's kingdom movement in our lives in a way that we know God is calling us to do. And so this is the power behind our daily bread. Now, one of the things that I just want to highlight before we go any further in the conversation is a really helpful quote from N.T. Wright. And this is in his book on the Lord's Prayer, which is linked under all of the episodes in this mini-series on the Lord's Prayer at walkingthetext.com. But this is what he says, and I find this to be really helpful. He says, the danger with the prayer for bread is that we get there too soon. And here's what he's talking about. This is where I typically do my prayer time. So this is why I'm shooting it in this space, and those of you who have watched the teaching series before will probably remember the other episode I talked about from this space. But this is where I come and I offer my prayers to God early in the morning. And the impetus at times for me, or I mean not necessarily the impetus, the struggle at times is just to sit down in this chair and to open my mouth in prayer and just start asking God for, the shopping list or the laundry list of all the things that I need him to do in my life. And it's like, that's where my prayer begins. Now, it's okay to have an approach where, whatever is coming to your head, you offer that to God. I typically will do that, if I'm in the car car, if I'm on a run, or if I'm out walking, or if I'm just in a time of silence and solitude somewhere, like I'll do that from time to time. But when it comes to this prayer, understand where the petition for daily bread comes. And that is, it comes after we have oriented ourselves to who God is. And even in the midst of this teaching, the structure of this teaching has already have followed that structure, where again, we begin by the sense of our Father who is in heaven, like being reminded of who God is. He is always near us. May your glory spread. May your name, right, be holy and sanctified. May your kingdom come. Like, this is ultimately about what God desires. And now I get to play a part in God's kingdom advancing here on earth, which is what Jesus' entire life and ministry was all about. And so when we come to God with our prayer requests, we want to be careful that we don't do this before we have oriented ourselves to this larger story. Because I think at times we'll just come thinking, well, this story's about me, and here's all my requests, and here's my laundry list of things I need help with, or here's the shopping list of all the things that I want, and we just don't anchor it well in the larger story. And so one of the ways that I have built this into my own rhythm, and maybe it'd be helpful for you, is that every morning when I sit down in this chair, the very first thing that I do before I open my mouth in prayer is that I open up my journal that I have on my iPad. I've actually got a couple of journals, but the first journal is my Grounded in Gratitude journal. And I write down 2 things I am grateful for from the day before. And I literally call this my Grounded in Gratitude journal. So I did a teaching in the teaching series called Grounded in Gratitude, and I talked about how if we are not grounded in gratitude, like if this isn't something that just sits at the foundation of who we are, we're going to struggle in our relationship with God, we're going to struggle in our relationship with others, we're just going to struggle in life. But if we ground ourselves in gratitude, it just changes how we interact with God and others and the circumstances that come our way. And so I will do that, and that will be the first part of my prayer is, Dear God, thank you. Thank you, and I do at least 2 things, and I write them down so that I have like a tracking of all the ways God has met me. So on those mornings or those days where I just kind of feel like God is off into the distance and has abandoned me in some way, or I feel disgruntled or whatever, I can look and go, oh, like 60 times every month, like I've highlighted a way that God has met me. So I do ground it in gratitude. The second thing I do is something that my friend Don Cousins taught me to do. In fact, I heard him do a teaching on this once. I just found this to be so helpful that I implemented it and thought this is a great idea. And that is that I will sit for a few minutes after I've done the gratitude and just said, God, help me to review yesterday. Is there anything that I did yesterday that was not the right decision? Was I short with my wife or my kids? Was I not respectful to somebody? Did I actually spend too much time doing something that I shouldn't have been doing? And not maybe necessarily a bad thing. Like I did a lot of good things yesterday, but were they the best things? God, did I just make some poor decisions? Is there anything that I just need to repent of? And God, help me to be better today. Help me to be better in those circumstances. And so if I do that every single day, then every day gets analyzed. And it just reminds me to go, God, what are the things that I should be doing, or what am I not doing that is not allowing me to experience the fullness of what you have to offer? And maybe I'm not being the best conduit through which your kingdom is advancing through me to impact other people. And so grounded in gratitude, analyzing yesterday, and then as we open this prayer, like I'm just reminded again, this is about God's kingdom, God's glory, God's name advancing. I get to play a part, and then at that point, I bring my requests to God. And when I do it in that order, I feel like that the requests I bring to God are more in line with the things I believe God would want me to be asking for. And one of the ways that I kind of analyze this is I have a prayer journal. And this prayer journal serves a couple of purposes for me, but one is it allows me to remember all the things that I want to be praying for. So in my prayer journal, I have a section on my family, I have a section for myself, I have a section for walking the text, I have a section for extended family and friends, and then I have another section on just the big world needs and things that I want to be praying for. And in our very last episode in this series, I want to talk to you a little bit more about how to utilize the Lord's Prayer and how I utilize the Lord's Prayer and different ways in which you can do that. But just suffice to say, I have this prayer journal where I am coming to God with specific requests. So it's not just that popcorn, whatever comes to the top of my head. It's like I am being very intentional to figure out, what am I asking God for? Why am I asking God for this? What do I want to make sure I don't forget to ask God for? And so that serves that purpose. The second thing that it serves a purpose for is it allows me to track the ways in which God is meeting me in my prayer requests and answering them. So maybe that would be helpful for you. But when we talk about this in terms of the daily bread, like, I believe that Jesus wants to come before him every day and say, God, this is what I need today. And in some cases, it is literally daily bread. That for some of you who are watching this, like maybe that first century audience, the majority of those people in that first century audience, they were poor. And so they had like basic needs for bread, for food, for water, for clothing. And maybe for some of you, that's the case. I mean, we recognize that more than 100 different countries are being represented by people who watch the teaching series. And so maybe for some of you, you're in a part of the world where like this is a daily need. Maybe for others of you, like your pantries are full, you have a faucet you can turn on, like your daily needs of food and bread, water, clothing, like that is already met. And now it's just moving into, okay, so what are the needs that you have? And I would just remind us, friends, that this prayer we're supposed to pray daily and boldly, and we'll talk about collaboratively in a moment, is that you bring your request before God, that no request is insignificant to God. And that it might be around, healing and physical ailments. It might be around like you're trying to navigate a challenging decision. Or it might be just this, or it might be that. And you go, just, dear God, meet me in my request. Help me for my daily needs. And when you do offer those prayers and then you do kind of track them in a way, I think it's also going to help you to see the kinds of things you do pray for, to go, is this in line what God is asking me to pray for? And this is where a really helpful quote from this book, Lord Teach Us, which is also linked under all the episodes in this series by William Willimon and Stanley Hauerwas, talks about how that when we do pray for daily bread, it can actually reorient us to how we're praying for daily bread and what constitutes daily bread. And so this is the other side of the equation. I love this. He says that they say this: for us, we ought to pray for the grace to be able to say, in a culture of overconsumption, give us the grace to know when enough is enough. Or help us to say no when the world entices us with so much. In praying this prayer, perhaps we will learn to get back to basics. Perhaps we will become schooled in desiring what we really need rather than that which we desire. And so we come to God and we pray this prayer, and it helps us also to analyze what kinds of things are we praying for. Now, here's the other facet to the Lord's Prayer of daily bread that I think is so interesting that we need to spend a few moments touching upon. Give us today our daily bread. Here's that collaborative thing. We've been saying throughout this series that this prayer is love God and love others. And so when we come to God in prayer and we say, give us today our daily bread, it causes us to pause and to say, dear God, is there anybody in my world, in my orbit, who has a daily need or has some need that I need to be praying for? So again, for me, the way that I try to live this out is I have a segment on extended family and friends to go, what do they need? And some of them are like, for the next several weeks, I need you to be praying for me for this every single day. Wisdom for this decision I have to make 4 weeks from today, or whatever the case may be. In other times, it causes us to pause and go, God, is there any way that I'm supposed to respond to this need that someone else has? And it's beyond just prayer. It's a form of how do we love one another well? Is there anybody that I need to reach out for? Because they may be waking up every day going, dear God, would you help me with this? And when we're praying the prayer, give us today our daily bread, God goes, you are the answer to their prayer. You are the answer to what I want to do in their lives. And so I believe that this is a prayer that, friends, spurs on generosity. That this is how the kingdom advances most powerfully, is that when we live a life of generosity with our time, generosity with our finances, generosity with our words of encouragement, generosity just with when we spend time with one another and we reach out. Because friends, this is a prayer that is intended to be prayed daily, boldly, and collaboratively. And I believe that this reminds us in this moment, generosity needs to be at the core of how we live out God's kingdom movement. And then finally, I would just mention this. It's give us this day our daily bread. It's something that is for today. That it's not that we don't pray for things that come in the future and for, proper planning down the road and for this and for that, but it's just to be reminded that God desires to be our daily source of sustenance. And so it is a request for today. It's not allowing the future to wig us out. It is about coming to God and saying, God, this is my request for today. Help me to live within your grace for today. Meet me where I need you to meet me today. And then I'll come to you tomorrow with tomorrow's needs. But allow me to be focused on today. And friends, I believe that if we can just anchor ourselves in who God is, if we can come to this prayer with our daily needs, recognizing that we're saying, God, this is what we need in order to live out what you're calling us to do, to be reminded it is communal in nature and it is a daily plea to God to take care of our needs now. Friends, I believe that our prayer life will take on a greater depth and significance in how we more intentionally walk out what God is calling us to do in our lives. And I believe that that is all wrapped up in saying, give us today our daily bread. So friends, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And as we've been doing throughout this entire series, let's close with the Lord's Prayer together. Our Father, who is in heaven, holy be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done here on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. And friends, may you walk out this prayer well in your life.